Hello everybody, CVH here, and in today's video we're going to return to some Clockwork City first impressions. In this series, I go over my first impressions of cards that have been revealed by the community recently, and in today's video we have a pretty full 7 cards to talk about, so this video might get a bit long. If you want to skip to a specific card to hear my thoughts on it, a particular card that would interest you that you've seen over the past week get revealed, I will try to put the timestamps correctly in the one of the top pinned comments down there, so feel free to skip around if that interests you. And otherwise, let's just get right into it and talk about some revealed cards from Return to Clockwork City coming to Legends on November 30th. First up, we have Hunter Killers, a 7 Magicka Strength card, 3/4, summon, battle an enemy creature, then battle another enemy creature. So of course when it battles, basically it's not an attack, it doesn't count as an attack, but you'll simply be trading stats like you would if you had attacked something, and then Hunter's Killers gets to do it again. I'm not going to spend too much time on this card because the pretty much universal opinion is that it's fairly weak. 7 cost, 3/4, unlikely to really survive the first battle with too much, and if it does, it more than likely will not survive the second battle. This is a card that some people have said might be good against a deck with a lot of weak creatures, and people think token decks for that, but I really don't see a 7 cost removal this week being too powerful against a deck that wants to have you dead by turn 5 or 6. So I'm not particularly inclined to think Hunter's Killers will see play in pretty much anything, and that kind of includes Arena for me too, pretty much strictly worse than Skyborn Dragon. But Matt Oblivion made a good point on the subreddit, which was that this seems like a card that was designed with the pre-nerf Praetorian Commander and Echo of Akatosh in mind. Praetorian Commander used to give everything in your deck +2/+2 on summon, and Echo of Akatosh used to have the summon ability to give each creature in your deck a random keyword. So yeah, if this thing comes out with Ward or Lethal, or if it's been buffed to a 5/6 or even potentially a 7/8 or something like that, if Praetorian Commander was played twice using some other effect or just 2 commanders, yeah, that would have made a pretty powerful Engine Crusader, I think. But unfortunately, where we're at now, deck buffs aren't too common, and we haven't seen the entire set yet. If we get some good deck buffs, there is one to talk about in today's video. Maybe this changes, but as of right now, I think Hunter's Killers is pretty weak. Moving on, we have Clockwork Dragon, and this is a card that people think is significantly stronger than Hunter's Killers. The reception to this card has been way more positive. 5 cost, 4/4 with summon. If Clockwork Dragon's in the left lane, it gets +2/+0 and drain, otherwise +0/+2 and guard. So a couple things to note. It is important to note that this is a summon effect. It's not a static. If it's in the left lane, it has this. If it's in the right, it has this. So you can't really do any movement shenanigans with a card like Shadow Shift, switch lanes, and then change the stats and the effect of Clockwork Dragon. I think maybe in a previous version it was like that, but this is a summon ability, so it's simply going to check which lane you play the card in and give it the appropriate buff. But that does still allow you some element of choice, and that's important in a card like this, strategic depth. This reminds me a lot of Druid of the Claw from Hearthstone. Hearthstone, specifically the Druid class, has had these sort of choose one effects for a long time, and those have always been some of the more intriguing cards because you can basically just use them for whatever's appropriate for the situation, and that's kind of where Clockwork Dragon fits. I'm a little bit less sold on this card in first glance than a lot of people that I've seen have been. A lot of people think it's going to be just amazing. This card does have its limitations. For example, if you're up against an aggro deck and you desperately need to gain life, it's turn 5 and you're getting really dangerously low, so you want to get the +2/+0 and drain, you have to play it in the field lane for that, and the field lane is where things go to essentially die immediately a lot of the time. Your aggro deck opponent is likely going to have taken over the field lane because that's where you pretty much start your push, and if you haven't already taken control back of the field lane, it only has 4 health, Clockwork Dragon is likely to die. And if you're looking for that guard to stop your opponent's creatures, if they're in the field lane and they're fighting for it and they're still hitting you in there, and you haven't been able to take over the field lane with like a Hive Defender on the previous turn, if you want a guard, it's just going to have to go in the Shadow lane, and if you want the drain, it's just going to be pretty much traded into immediately with less health. So this card does have its limitations, but you can't really knock a 6-power drain that you could play in pretty much any class you want with added versatility. And I think they mentioned this is really the only dragon in the expansion, so this could, again, buff dragon decks if they want to use them. I've seen some talk about it in Dragon Scout, but it competes with Thorn Mage. I don't really know exactly where this is going to sit in the meta, but I do think it's a really solid all-around card that will probably see at least a fair bit of play. Personally though, I must say, for a neutral card or neutral synergy deck, I am still very excited about Hulking Fabricant's 5-cost 8/8 body. The next card is Galen the Shelter, and this is the card I was referencing when I talked about deck buffs. This is a 3 Magicka 3/3 unique legendary in Endurance. Summon, choose a creature or item in your hand, shuffle 3 copies of it with +3/+3 into your deck. of potentially very powerful and potentially game-breaking effect. However, balanced by the fact that Galen the Shelter is not going to be developing any additional disruption on the board when you play it. It's not going to be impacting anything. You're simply playing a 3-cost, 3/3 vanilla for the time being, with some potential to completely just do crazy stuff later in the game. Now, obviously opinions are flying about this card. I want to just go on record and say, due to its nature not impacting the board immediately and being, not the strongest of 3-drops, it's not something you hate playing on 3, but you never want to include a 3-cost 3/3 vanilla in your deck, period. This is sort of I wouldn't say it's broken. I definitely wouldn't. Against aggro decks, you're pretty unlikely to ever get too much value out of this effect, similar to Ungolem or the Conjuration tutor that shuffles the Lava Atronachs into your deck. But in the long game, this could really pay off. As a late game draw, this card again could be pretty weak, especially if you're running low on cards in your hand, as typically does happen in a lot of decks in the late game. But in the early game, if you invest your 3 Magicka, get a reasonable enough body to get trading, and you have a powerful target for this in your hand, late in the game that could really pay off. My first inclination was to think about this in Ramp Scout and using cards like Parthenax or Tazcat or Red Brahmin, those unique legendaries that you can already sort of make do with multiples of them because you have Solitaire in your deck, but Galen the Shelter could buff cards like Tazcat, Charged Giant Bat, or those really unique legendaries, and you can just have that additional value in the late game, which seems pretty nuts to me. But then I started thinking about this a little more in other decks. We have Item Sorcerer. You would have to be playing the Sorcerer version for this because it is an endurance card, so you'd have to be an intelligence and endurance in those versions. But you could just have a crazy amount of Master of Arms or Gardener of Swords, and if you want to just develop a body on turn 3, you could duplicate Enchanted Plate, shuffle 3 at 2-cost +3/+6 items that draw you a card when you play them into your deck. And item combo decks are among my favorite decks ever, so that's where my mind likes to go when I think of new cards, but also they're decks with a lot of cycle. They filter through their deck incredibly fast. If you've ever watched any of the highlights of me playing an item deck on this channel, you will know that. So this is potentially even more reliable in those kinds of decks, despite not doing anything immediately. And whether or not you're shuffling an item in, or whether or not you're shuffling a Master of Arms or a Gardener to get all those additional copies, that could give you some incredible power once the combos really start rolling. And I also want to shout out Brasilisk. I eventually sort of came to this conclusion after thinking about Galen long enough. I was wondering, will we see enough reliable ways to buff Brasilisk, and this card will shuffle more copies of Brasilisk into your deck if you're deciding to focus around that card. All of a sudden, Brasilisks are 5/5 in your deck, so when you draw that 3-cost, it's going to have 5/5 of stats and enable you to do crazy amounts of pings to it to develop more copies of Brasilisk, which is pretty solid to me. You could also use this on Enchanted Plate or a card like that in the Brasilisk deck if that becomes a thing. I just like the idea of this card with several, not only just the really powerful unique legendaries that your mind might gravitate towards first, but also just like the high utility cards, some cheaper things that you'll just be able to draw more copies of just with insane buffs depending on the deck. So I wouldn't say this is a staple by any means in endurance decks. I saw at least 1 or 2 people saying that. A 3-cost 3/3 that doesn't develop on the board is simply not enough pressure for most aggressive endurance deck, and could prove to be a little too unreliable in the long game in a lot of these decks unless you really need this kind of effect. But I can already think of some situations where this effect could be really crazy. Next up, Phalanx Exemplar. 5-cost, 5/6, guard, and when your opponent draws a prophecy from a rune being destroyed, put a 1/2 Septum Guardsman with guard into your hand. So, similar to Dark Guardian, this card cares about your opponents getting prophecies, and it sort of adds additional ways to actually benefit from that, because usually it's just like your heart sinks and then something nuts happens to you and you probably get in a worse position in the game. But this card just seems good. 5-cost, 5/6, we already have a Cave Bear of stats with an upside, guard, and then with an additional upside that maybe doesn't seem like the most high impact thing when it comes to either drawing a card from the top of your deck or drawing a 1/2 Septum Guardsman. You'd probably like the card more often than not, but this card just has good stats. It's a 5-cost, 5/6 that trades favorably with a ton of things that your opponent's going to be playing by that point. In fact, the vast majority of things. So people have already mentioned this card not only in control decks, but even in token decks. You're playing this card on turn 5 can really give you an edge against other aggressive strategies. If you start going in for destroying your opponent's runes, they get prophecies, you get Septum Guardsmans, and token decks have a pretty wide variety of ways to buff Septum Guardsman. You can just play it when you have a 5th Legion trainer out. Septum Guardsman already sees some play in Token Monk alongside Goblin Skulk to get them for free. This is another way to get those Septum Guardsmen for free. And of course, you're getting more guards into your hand, so maybe if we get a little bit better guard support, maybe a guard-themed deck. I think one of the pre-constructed decks, I forget which one, but one of them focuses on guards, and it's pretty abysmal. But if we get more cards like this and more cards that can buff guards more reliably, maybe eventually we see that be a thing. But, I'm not totally sure if we're going to see this card in a lot of control decks or a lot of token decks, but I feel like it's going to fit in somewhere just because the card has good stats. Guard is definitely very relevant around turn 5 when you're still trying to stabilize against aggro, and the effect could potentially be very cool. This is actually another card I was able to reveal. I mentioned last week Messinar was a card that I was able to reveal just on this channel, so if you haven't seen that video yet, it is still here. Feel free to check it out. But I actually got to reveal this with Pete Hines, DC Deacon, on the official Bethesda stream this past Friday, and it is just a kind of a powerhouse card for Factotums. Assemble, choose 2, +2/+0, +0/+2, deal 2 damage to your opponent, or you gain 2 health. So these Factotums, when you play them, you usually get to choose one. This card lets you choose 2, and it buffs all the other Factotums in your hand and your deck. So assuming we get enough Factotums to support this card, if you didn't hear me talk about this on Bethesda stream, I will be sort of just rehashing what I said there. It'll probably come down as much larger than a 4/4 on turn 6. So that's a sigh of relief immediately, because on the surface the stats look kind of bad. And then you get to choose like all the other Factotums in your deck. You could give them +2/+2, or you could give them +2 attack and turn them all into Camlorn heroes, basically dealing 2 damage on summon. If you're up against a slower deck, maybe you need to give them more health so you can stay out of range of cards like Ice Storm. If you're up against another aggressive deck, you could start giving them, you gain 2 health, so every time you play one, it's basically a Priest of the Moons. This card, has a lot of versatility, and I think would just be completely absurdly broken if you could play 3 copies of it. Fortunately, it's a unique legendary, but like I said on the Bethesda stream, this is pretty much the exact card I think Factotums would have needed to see a lot of play. Yet another neutral card is next. Treasure Map, 3-cost item, +1/+1, with summon, draw a card. If the wielder has Treasure Hunt, draw something they're hunting for instead. We've seen a couple of these treasure hunt creatures revealed so far. Basically, you have to draw a specific type of card, such as an action or an item or something like that, and when you do, you get a potential upside from the card. This card strikes me as interesting for just the basic 3-cost summon draw card item, because like I mentioned, I'm a simple man, I love my item combo decks, and this card is very comparable to Tome of Alteration. It's a 3-cost instead of a 4, and you're getting +1/+1 less stats, so I guess that'd be -1/-1 compared to the Tome. But I think that might be a concession people are willing to make just to add that extra cycle into the deck. Now, I've been playing a good amount of the item Battle Mage recently, and that deck doesn't have access to Enchanted Plate. This could just give us additional ways to draw cards. If you're playing the item Sorcerer, you could play Enchanted Plates, Tome of Alterations, Daggerfall Mages to get more Tome of Alterations, and Treasure Maps. Now, maybe we're verging on too many, but that's a deck that really likes to cycle through its cards, and this card does help significantly. I don't think we've seen quite as many Treasure Hunt cards as I would need to really say, yeah, this will make Treasure Hunt cards and Treasure Hunt decks playable and a viable strategy, but I will say on the surface this card just looks pretty decent. Besides the Treasure Hunt synergy and the item decks that already exist, not really seeing this fitting in any other decks, but I could be wrong. But it already sort of makes me feel like experimenting a bit more with the item decks, and we'll have to wait and see what other Treasure Hunt creatures get revealed. The last card for this video today is Grappling Hook, yet another item. I'm sorry for the poor quality screenshot. I did this video pretty quickly after Grappling Hook was revealed, so I can't find the PNG quite yet. But we have a 4-cost item in Strength, +3/+2 with summon, move an enemy creature into this lane, it loses cover. Now, this card is one of the most interesting cards I think was revealed so far. Immediately, my mind does not go to an aggro deck. We really don't want to be adding items to our cards that are not great stats for the cost in an aggro deck, and we don't really want to force our opponent to contest our creatures with a lot of items. We'd rather just they do their own thing and we'll just hit them in the face a bunch. But this card is an incredibly high utility card for slower decks using Strength, I think. So many times I was playing against a deck like Control Warrior, which uses cards like Falkreath, Defiler, and Blood Magic Lord, and other cards that are similar with Slay abilities that could get potentially very crazy. And, you know, a lot of those cards and combos are slow, clunky, bad for lack of a better word. You just don't see that deck a whole lot. When it goes off, it's crazy. When it doesn't, it's just, like, pretty awful, like I mentioned. But how many times have I been sitting against a Falkreath Defiler or a Blood Magic Lord in the late game, and I'm over in my own lane, I just say to myself, wow, I'm really glad this Control Warrior deck doesn't have access to Shadow Shift. It only has Quicksilver Crossbow to use those slay effects by pinging off something with 1 health, which can occasionally be good as well, don't get me wrong. But no Shadow Shift means I have to worry a lot less about those really relevant slay effects, especially when they're very powerful and I just don't have removal for whatever creature has the effect. Now Grappling Hook throws all that right on its head. All of a sudden, my opponent plays a Falkreath Defiler in the Shadow lane. Not only can I not contest it, but I have to play around Grappling Hook now, which means I can't play anything with 6 or less health and know that it's going to be safe, because if I play a 6/6, my opponent can simply play a Grappling Hook on their Falkreath Defiler, force the 6/6 over, and then, you know, it loses cover, so even if you're moving it into the Shadow lane, you're getting to attack it. That's kind of the point of the Grappling Hook, and they're just going to eat my guy, potentially trade up with something much more valuable, and get whatever crazy slay effect. This is not only buffing the attack, but it's also buffing the health somewhat, so depending on the size of the creature you're forcing over, you could potentially survive the trade and move on and get more slay effects as well. This card is really, really cool to me, and it's one of those cards that I like it because it makes a card that was revealed a while ago, for me that's like Falkreath Defiler, or maybe Blood Magic Lord 2, it's fallen off, just old school cards that were experimented a lot with, and just have sort of fallen by the wayside. A lot of more powerful cards have come out since then, and a lot of those gimmicky combo decks were experimented with a fair bit, but then people just deemed them too inconsistent for ranked play, basically. But this is one of those cards that can really change that and make those cards better once again. So we might be seeing more Falkreath Defilers, we might be seeing more Control Warrior decks. The whole deck basically was really cool, but just sort of, you know, fell out of favor. People realized Unstoppable Rage could be abused a bit harder in Archer. Don't get me wrong, Rage Archer is still a fantastic deck, but this card could really make those slay abilities that you see mostly in Endurance way more consistent. But as always, these are just my thoughts on the previewed cards that we've seen over the course of the past week or so. Feel free to let me know in the comments what you think about any of the cards we discussed today. Let me know if you think I'm spot on, if you think I missed something huge, and where you're excited to play these cards once the set comes out again. Return to Clockwork City coming out November 30th for Elder Scrolls Legends. Hopefully you guys enjoyed the video. As always, if you did, feel free to leave a like and stay subscribed for more Legends content. Follow my stream in the description, and I'll see you next time.